Before handing over the session to the moderator, I have a little announcement to make. Morning tea is served at the back. You guys can have it while the session continues. Sir, over to you.
हाँ यही मैं कर कर देना अभी तो कोई नहीं I request everybody who are interested in listening to what the speakers have to say, please settle down so we can start this session. Okay, as the topic has already been announced, this is about nuclear escalation risk reduction and confidence building measure. चंद लोग रह गए वो भी पीछे बड़ी डिस्टर्बेंस हो रही है जरा थोड़ा सा मैं ख्याल 1-2 मिनट हाँ नहीं कर ठीक है okay. The two questions that have been allocated for this panel discussion or the session, how the global and regional crises or conflicts are increasing the nuclear risk. The second is the recent conflict between India and Pakistan has impacted the conventional and nuclear deterrence dynamics, how the risk of nuclear escalation be minimized. So we have this wonderful panel of experts, my colleagues, boss, friends, and the student. They don't need any introduction. So I'll just briefly, the current position, Commodore Khalid Banoori, he's the first Director General of Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs, and currently affiliated with the Air Force PF Air Headquarters as an advisor. So we'll start with you, and you want to, let's see others.
Somebody's going to put on my PowerPoint. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Adil. Thank you, SVI. Escalation, nuclear risk reduction, CBMs. The kind of interest I see here, I think my presentation is escalation, yes. Nuclear risk reduction, you really think so? CBM, nah. That's the presentation I'm going to make, but since you expect me to, I will take a few minutes and talk about this. All right, this is my sequence. Just to talk about instability, escalation, what leads to it, so that we can identify where are we standing today, where is the nuclear risk reduction going, what is about the situation of the CBM fatigue, and then the May war experience. That's what I want to do, so that I come back to what the future holds for us. Just some quick definitional aspects. A crisis is condition of instability or danger, as in social, economic, political, or international affairs, leading to a decisive change. Instability is the fear that the other side is about to attack. And crisis stability will be when a potential or ongoing conflict, when you don't have strong incentive to initiate an attack or escalate a conflict, even if the tensions are high. So that is the stability that you're looking for. Neither side feels compelled to use its weapons first out of fear of being attacked. Now, you will see some busy slides, but no worries on this. I will point out where I want you to focus. This is, in general, death by PowerPoint, but I will try to bend it the way I can. So the strategies involving threat to influence others' behavior, different aims and objective, deterrence to prevent someone to the other side to take an undesirable action, compellence to make someone take a specific action, both by a kind of threat of punishment, and coercion, encompassing both of those ideas. So what is a situation where no strong incentive to initiate attack or escalate exists? That will be mutual deterrence, that will be mutual confidence, effective crisis management. But the challenges today are new technologies, the altering strategic balance, and creation of the new vulnerabilities. We've heard a lot about the no first use and no first use or first use doctrine. Um, in a times of conflict, this is the first casualty that gets thrown out of the window. These ideas about no first use, and we've heard this in the previous session. Escalation risk, nuclear, conventional, but also of the unintended escalation is something that we need to continue to think about. And to just to complicate this situation, disinformation, which is, I'm saying these things which you're already familiar with, and for just to ask you a question, how many of these factors do you see in South Asia thus far? All of them? And if they are, it's getting complicated. So here are the recipes of instability and escalation. Mistrust and suspicion. India alleging that terrorism supported, sponsored, or allowed by Pakistan. Pakistan taking the position of false flag, historical evidence, gaps in the Pahalgam story. And Chidambaram's recent statement actually is an honest admission that evidence that India has, and it's their own. But Indian miscalculation, we've heard about this in the morning, we've in one way or the other, we've heard about this yesterday, the miscalculation of when it's striking the so-called terror outfits, expecting that Pakistani military will opt out from reacting. So here's a big problem that the lessons that they are being drawn are different for different states, and that complicates the situation. The risk factor, of course, is presence of nuclear weapons, but India continuing with the brinkmanship, so-called calling of the bluff, and Pakistan exercising restraint with viable conventional response. Does that mean the nuclear factor? This are we saying practically no first use? Of course not. And that is something that one has to understand, that the restraint does not really mean that. Media misinformation or disinformation, the hyper nationalism in India, the Dunning-Kruger effect, if you will, Pakistan with a focused response. Diplomacy, Pakistan expecting and asking other states to make independent assessments has helped this time. New technologies, India taking this position, it has superior weapons, Rafale, S-400, cutting edge technologies. And Pakistani position has simply been, do not let your weapons cross our borders. So thresholds. So that's the sense that you have. But a bit of an Indian masala, arrogance of power, the absence and a continued absence of a dialogue process, more on that later. Third party factor, India thinking that US will take our side, and Trump saying, we will see. And in the latest Trump uttering, you now hear of the 7 aeroplanes that India has lost in that war. The increasing numbers goes on. I have written elsewhere that they were kill criteria was met on at least 2 or 3 more. So let's see. Increased risk tolerance, comparative, for example, Balakot and beyond. But India, assertive new normal or versus Pakistan never crossed my threshold. These are issues. Technical equipment and system, Chinese, Western systems, and so those apprehensions or those expectations have, some of them have turned out utterly wrong. The perceptions of the world at large, India will push Pakistan around. But once they realize that Pakistan is not a walkover, then pushing a ceasefire due to fear of nuclear escalation. So here's the thought. When there's fear of nuclear escalation, the world wants to act. When, if at all, as per this forecasting fictional work, 2034, the next world war, when a nuclear exchange happens, the world gets together. This is what they did after the First World War. This is what they did after the Second World War. When millions died, then they got together to say, no, this needs to stop. These are some of those things that one have to continue. And Indian continues to have this new normal analogy that we give a befitting response, rejecting nuclear blackmail, and this is state-sponsored. But what are the broader imperatives? era of new technologies, and we have heard in the previous session about the emerging and disruptive technology. Escalation by India is an evolving posture, and it doesn't seem to be going away, and we need to factor that in. The nuclear rhetoric raises tensions, disinformation clouds the environment, and even clouds the judgment sometimes. So one has to, take it what you will. So what does this really mean? That all the ingredients, or almost all the ingredients that can cause instability are right here. So Indian intent for deliberate escalation, what do we do then? The pendulum swings. And I now come back specifically to South Asia to say that it has been a crisis-prone region. Several incidents have already happened, but military factor, conventional force asymmetries, new technologies, the doctrine of retaliating massively, the arrogance and provocative positioning, Qatal ki Raat, and so on and so forth. And then this provocative doctrine all point at the possibilities of instability, factored or engineered instability. Non-state actors' ability to trigger crises and stall peace process or the dialogue exists and has increased over the time. The role of the third parties, yes, but is the situation that you deal with. There's lack of trust, there's lack of political resolve, and India continues to be dismissive about this, and all this results in frequently stalemated dialogue process. As I said, I will come back to CBM later, but whether nuclear risk reduction. This is a busy slide, so please don't bother about it. Just look at this first column. Conflict avoidance measures to crisis management to long-range stabilization. The pendulum swings between the first two only. When there is a crisis situation, there is an effort to stop that crisis, cause ceasefire, and so on and so forth. When it is stabilized, a little bit of talk of the CBMs, but then never an attempt to stabilize peace. So we swing on one side of the pendulum. And this is what is all about Pakistan and India. What are the things that can actually help? Are several steps, but we have hardly gone in that direction. So that's the point I wanted to make here. In case of nuclear, specifically, what are the paths to nuclear war? These five. Escalation of conventional war, and we saw that this time it was saved. Will it be saved every time? Is a question that one has to understand. Preemption in crisis, accidental unauthorized use, always a possibility. Initiation by a third party. And I love to refer to this fictional novel that I mentioned to you, 2034, the Next World War. Some of the actions after the first nuclear exchange are initiated by a third party. Actions to impede war between China, impede nuclear war between China and the US. And then this issue of surprise attack, which is a destabilizer that happens. There was a Stimson study that brought in 10 factors of nuclear risk reduction. The last one was dumb blind luck. You do everything that you can, but there is this factor that comes in and that it helps you factor this in. Existing CBMs, I think this audience is very, very familiar with, and I have the honor to have known every person on all the panels, yesterday and today. So, I know that everyone is familiar with these, what exists. But what is important is that most significant CBM process was the Composite Dialogue 2004 onwards. Several rounds with disruptions. I had the honor to be participating in each one of them. The last round after disruptions was in 2012. How many years? Nothing on the table. When we started the dialogue process, the Western powers would generally say, you guys are talking to each other. And it was so difficult to get the Soviets to the table in the first place. They never saw that India would come to the table and drag its feet. And that, by implication, has started to come up. And then you come up with this new destabilizer, RSS, BJP, and the so-called Modi approach. What if Modi changes tomorrow? the approach will remain. What if the next Indian government is Congress? The hardened positions will have to be taken up by Congress also. That's the only way to political success. Why? Look at the Indian elections, and they're coming up in 2026. The Indian elections have always managed this in a manner where the rhetoric is about Pakistan, not about their own domestic politics. Think of the Pakistani elections, we only talk about the other party within our country. So, sheer brinkmanship, domestic audience, and international messaging is always what they do. There's a CBM fatigue, and it seems to not go away. And then came the May War. This is just a show off. And so, why, what, how? All the recipes and the masala came into play to make this Indian broth. Brinkmanship, willing to escalate, arrogance about, let's say, Rafales and S-400. But more importantly, I've said this earlier, learning differing lessons. So wrong calculus is the reason for further escalation. Disarray, technical as well as at human level. When the aeroplanes were shot down, then there was this confusion, there was this disarray. And the May War, many assessments and commentaries exist, and I'm sure this audience is very familiar. The canvases, kinetic, non-kinetic operations, space, EW spectrum, cyber, multi-domain and simultaneity, and energy and synergy and cold calculus were the different lines. And at every level, tactics, strategy, operationalization, leadership, time and space relationship, everything. The main focus on the complexity. How did all this happen? Rome wasn't built in a day. So this is what helped Pakistan. Acquired toil, niche acquisitions, tightening of the belt, realistic training, and so on and so forth. There's the synergy that I've seen amongst the three services at strategic as well as tactical level, and I've talked to several at the tactical level. I have never seen this in my life. I hope it stays to whatever extent possible in the air operations, tactics, placement, timing, strategies, and cyber factor. The Air Force being the supported command was not only accepted but was helped in all ways. So also within PAF, kinetic non-contact operations, cyber management, grid control, putting the grid off at that moment is something that happens. Are we back to the future? And others 3 minutes are about to be over. So what happens now? The battle has ended, the war persists. The next escalation is only a matter of time. Risk reduction is in a slumber. CBMs are on a death row. The next war will be different than this one. Indian ego took a bashing, so not easy to forget for them. Other fronts are likely in the future. Maritime, cyber, terror and espionage, counter value included. Technological advancements, what will save the day or not, surprises, character leadership, preparation at every rung of the ladder. I stop here. The whole of the nation approaches the solution for us. Thank you very much.
Dr. Jaspal was referring in his remarks in next panel में एक fighter pilot है तो fighter pilot ने 20 seconds time over target जो TOT we say, so he took 15 minutes and 20 seconds, sir. Excellent. And I expect के इजाज को भी
I apologize for those 20 seconds.
लेकिन I didn't have to indulge in strategic caution against my subordinates. Anyway, Ijaz is also, we consider him as equally a good fighter pilot because he keeps fighting on intellect. Yeah. So I think everybody knows Ijaz Haider. He's a renowned journalist since 1991. He has been writing as part of his duties and also personal interest on various strategic issues. These days, he's also a non-resident fellow at CISPR at University of Lahore. And it's always a pleasure listening to Ijaz. Ijaz, please. You have 15 minutes plus one is 20 seconds.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you also for giving out my age. Thank you to Dr. Naeem Salek. who's a mentor also, like an elder brother. I've learned a lot from him. Also, everyone at SBI who has facilitated my travel from Lahore and made it comfortable. I'm really grateful for that. So a lot of ground has already been covered in the previous session by Ambassador Akram, by Dr. Jaspal, and Ms. Khan. So, and of course, because we're playing in a small yard, so obviously we're going to overlap at multiple points. But what I try to do is to set the premise and try and sort of conceptualize it to also be a little provocative in terms of trying to move away from what we consider as conventional wisdom. So, two questions in terms of global risk as also regional risk. Let's get the direction of causality right, which is that states do not distrust each other because they're armed. They are armed because they distrust each other. So unless you get this causality right, disarmament efforts obviously are not going to be particularly useful. So, with reference to these two questions, I would consider that there are 5 factors here. And once again, many of those factors have already been discussed in the previous session, but I just want to flag them. One is, of course, that geopolitics is in a state of disarray, and your post World War II security architecture is crumbling. A lot of that is, owed to multiple variables and not just the arrival on the scene of President Donald Trump. Of course, Trump, in terms of his approaches, is hastening the crumbling of that architecture. And so clearly that is leading to a lot of trust deficit among the states. So that's one. Similarly, bilateral and multilateral arms control and non-proliferation regimes have either crumbled or are eroding. Again, a point that has been brought up amply in the previous session. Another point which has been touched upon in the previous session, but which I think is very important, is that conflicts between nuclear dyads and also non-nuclear weapon states and a nuclear weapon state are either happening, as we discussed this, or the chances of such conflicts are increasing. So you have India, Pakistan, you have India, China, you have Iran and the Zionist entity. I hate the term Israel because Israel is an illicit state. It's either occupied Palestine or it is a Zionist entity. And of course, Russia, Ukraine. So then, of course, we talk about the third nuclear age. There's a lot of politics behind that term, but we're not going to go into that. What this age characterizes is, again, a point that I want to emphasize is, and which I don't think has really been brought up in the previous session, is the entanglement of nuclear and non-nuclear strategic weapons. The weakening of nuclear norms, emerging and disruptive technologies has been talked about at length, which are, of course, getting integrated with nuclear command and control mechanisms, modernizing of the nuclear arsenals, and improvements in C4 ISR capabilities. So these are factors that are very important at the operational level. Then, of course, the neoliberal trade regime, which, of course, had a downside, loads of critics of that, but it had and it did create global supply chains, which resulted in interdependence and therefore the lessening of the possibility of conflicts. Now, that is giving way to economic nationalisms and technological autonomy. For instance, Biden administration had this term "small yard, high fence," and that administration went for policies that tried to kneecap Chinese technology, and that has forced the Chinese into moving towards technological autonomy with respect to semiconductor manufacturing at the high end, because, as you know, the chip technology is spread widely. I mean, the supply chain is spread widely over the globe. So all of this obviously directly and indirectly impact stability. And therefore, another point that I want to emphasize, that we need to revisit the idea of deterrence in the classical sense. Now, deterrence has always been a tricky affair. Okay, so I am not exactly a deterrence optimist, and I'm not exactly a deterrence pessimist. What I do believe is that the baseline, if you could maintain the baseline, which is that X can do terrible things to Y and Y can do terrible things to X, and therefore X and Y have decided that they're not going to mess with each other. If you can keep that baseline, then yes, deterrence would, stabilize. But the problem with human beings is that they try to create surplus, they try to do things that move away from baselines. And so you have the Greek mythological hero Achilles, who has a lance, which is an offensive weapon, but he also has a shield. And his shield is also impenetrable. So what the states do, that they try to create the lance also, and they want to have the shield also. So with the nuclear weapons, once you have the lance, but you also try to create the shield, you actually destabilize deterrence. And this is just one example. So there is also, when I talk about deterrence, this whole idea that since there has been no nuclear exchange, since the United States dropped 2 bombs on Japan, therefore there is not going to be a nuclear exchange, is statistically not really a good argument to make. So what I'm saying is that it is not possible to predict when and under what circumstances such an exchange could or might take place. We just seem to believe that given the terrible consequences of such an exchange, there won't be such an exchange. And that the leaders are rational beings and rationality precludes such a possibility. But frankly, rationality does not always guide human actions. And rational choice theory, if you look at the criticism of rational choice theory, the theory ignores that humans can never have perfect information. And they may not always act in their self-interest. Or how might they act if they consider that they have an existential threat? So you have got the social and cultural and psychological factors come into play. Then, of course, let's assume that the leaders are rationally, corresponding with each other. But what about a Soviet submarine, which the American frigates are trying to, force to come up to the surface? And the submarine's captain decides that he is going to launch a nuclear missile. And it's the XO of the submarine who prevails upon him, Arkhipov, and that it averts a nuclear exchange. So even when Khrushchev and JFK were rationally trying to figure out things, something could have happened below the surface, and the entire hue of the situation would have changed. So, and then you had, of course, remember the Thule Greenland radar malfunction. I mean, these are near misses during the Cold War. And the Americans did not immediately launch because Nikita Khrushchev was actually in New York. And they thought, well, how can the Soviets be doing this if their leader is in New York? So that was averted. Then you had the famous Stanislav Petrov incident in 1983 at the Oko Nuclear Early Warning Center. And there were warnings of incoming missiles. And he said, well, this can't be 5 missiles. No, it's got to be a bigger attack. So this is some kind of false alarm. And then another alarm comes, the more missiles coming in. But he decides that he is going to ignore them. And at great risk this is a judgment call. Imagine yourself in that position. But mercifully, he decided that he's going to ignore them. And that meant that, we, you and I can actually talk to each other because he ignored that. So this is where uncertainty and trade-offs come in. And remember, I say uncertainty. I'm not saying risk. And unfortunately, lots of times in nuclear strategy literature, these two terms are used interchangeably. Sometimes you can, but there is a subtle difference. Risk can be calculated. Banks calculate risk. Insurance agencies calculate risk. Uncertainty is something which you cannot calculate. And so it's the same thing with trade-offs. A state can decide to retaliate swiftly and adopt a launch and warning posture. So that requires warning postures and procedures that allow rapid authorization of nuclear launch. The downside is retaliation to a false alarm. It's the same with centralized or delegated control, what you call the always never dilemma. So the point about trade-offs is crucial. There is no policy or human action that does not have a trade-off. That includes marriage, by the way. So, you know, I often go to the range, and there is this whole debate among shooters whether the round should be chambered in the pistol